Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Episode. Here I got a fun and random episode for you guys this Friday because all of you have been asking me whether or not I would pick up an Anbernic Arc D handheld emulation device, mostly because it looks like a Sega Saturn controller, and of course you know I love Sega Saturn, so shockingly, not shockingly, I did pick one up to make a video on it just because you guys were asking me, so never say I don't do what you say. This one is for you. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the stupidity we do around this channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But right out of the box, I will say the Arc D is a very good looking handheld device. It basically is just a portable Sega Saturn in form factor, and the screen on it is spectacular. I've got no issues with that whatsoever. The screen is bright, vibrant, and I really absolutely do love that. And as a handheld device, it's got a nice weight to it, but the fact that it is shaped like a Sega Saturn controller with the same style D-pad, the same button layout, and the same color scheme, Anbernic's designers did a lot to try to make this look like a Sega official product. So 10 out of 10 high marks for that. It really does feel like something Sega could have released as a modern handheld console to celebrate the Saturn of yore. But let's get into the actual layout itself and talk about the buttons. We'll get into performance around minute 5 if you want to skip ahead. This D-pad is exceptional. All of the start and select buttons are good. The face buttons are decent. They don't feel exactly like a Sega Saturn controller, but they do feel nice enough that you're not going to have any issues whatsoever with them. But the Sega Saturn controller is long considered to be one of the best 2D gaming pads ever made, and I will say this D-pad gets like 90% of the way there. But to put it in perspective, here is my Japanese Sega Saturn pad, and you can see just how close these really are. The font on the buttons is not the same on the Anbernic versus the Sega Saturn. That embossing there has serifs on it, where the Anbernic is sans serif, if you even care about font style like that. But the big thing is the D-pad is very similar to a real Saturn controller, and you know people are going to love that. Now, as far as the shoulder buttons are concerned, they are wholly different, and I think a little bit of a miss here. The Sega Saturn has a micro switch, and it is very clicky. On the Anbernic, you have these two nice handholds in the back, but the actual shoulder buttons have this little plastic overhang, which I feel my finger slipping off of when I use. If you don't depress it at the right spot, you can miss an input. Both of the L1 and R1, L2 and R2 buttons just do not have the same tactile click I would want, especially if you're trying to emulate an original Sega Saturn controller. These shoulder buttons feel completely different. They've got a satisfying click. You know when you've pushed them both in your finger and that audible click feedback. Unfortunately on the Anbernic, it's like a middle tier C shoulder button. But the layout itself of the buttons really does work for all the games we're going to be testing on this, and in the hand I would say the weight distribution, the overall plastic feel, this doesn't feel like a Steam Deck for sure. It's not that premium price product, but for what they're asking for it, the build quality is decent, like a B to a B+, and all of the controls outside of the shoulder button do feel really good in my hand, so I'm going to give this like a B+, A- as far as the control layout is concerned. Now, outside of those shoulder buttons that you see right here, you'll see the rest of the buttons and all of the other configurable things we have. We've got a power button, volume up and down, and the F button is going to be for function, which is multi-use depending on what you're doing with it. You have a mini HDMI out and two USB-C ports that are going to be doing different things, but they definitely give you plenty of I/O up here. I just wish those shoulders were a little bit better, but you do get two of them, which is important, because if you want to try to emulate anything like PlayStation 1 versus Sega Saturn, you're going to remember that there's both an L1 and L2 and an R1 and R2, so the fact that there's two triggers on each side is going to allow us to do certain things. I will tell you right now, this footage is not running on the Arc D. This is just library footage I have of PlayStation 1 games on DuckStation, so be aware of that. Now on the bottom here, you're going to get a little reset pin button there. You have a headphone jack, and you have the two micro SD cards. The first one is going to hold the Linux installation and all the other underlying operating system. The second one you can fill up whatever you want with. And as far as the actual operating system is concerned, it is a no-frills, fully functional instance of Linux, and you'll see here you can navigate around between emulators and what runs on RetroArch, as well as go into the settings. It is perfectly functional. You can probably tweak this to your heart's content. I am just reviewing this as it comes out of the box with some games loaded up for testing. But again, the screen here is bright and vibrant. I think maybe you could even turn it down a little bit to prolong that battery life. And you will see if we go under system settings, this one is the unit that has the dual boot between Linux and Android. But just so you're aware, I'm only testing the Linux distribution today with what comes out of the box. If you want to see Android tests, leave me a comment down below and maybe I will get around to it. This is all stock, how these settings come when Anbernic delivers it to you. Yes, I understand emulators can be be changed. Yes, I understand settings can be tweaked, but I am reviewing this based upon your average consumer just wanting to play some games. And jumping right into Sega Rally here right now, I will say that it does a very valiant job of trying to emulate the Sega Saturn, but unfortunately for a device that's shaped and inspired like a Saturn controller, it is not doing the most amazing job of actually playing Sega Saturn games. You will see we have frame skip on, and sometimes it will get to that 60 frames per second mark, but it's going to drop down a decent amount of times here. Just watch that frame counter in the top left, we're already down into the high 40s. The other issue is there are definitely some emulation glitches up there. This shouldn't be happening on most emulators. It must be a settings issue in the box, but we'll go ahead and turn frame skip off just so we can see what it looks like when we do that. Unfortunately, this is not a Sega Rally that I would really want to play, and that's a little bit of a bummer, although I do need to give Anbernic all the passes in the world because they never show on their product page this actually runs the Sega Saturn. It is just inspired by it. So honestly, it's not like this product isn't meeting some sort of expectation. The expectation put on it is it's shaped like a Sega Saturn, so it will probably play Sega Saturn games relatively well. But let's move over to something a little bit easier on the system. This is Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and this is the Sega Saturn Japanese version. You're going to see off the top here, frame skip is on, but it's doing much better, and we are running at a locked 60 frames a second. So some Sega Saturn games are going to give you enough performance where you could realistically play from start to finish and enjoy it as a Sega Saturn handheld. It's just not going to be every single Saturn game in the library. You can't purchase this and expect it to play every game you've ever wanted perfectly. It is not the device for that. But now that we've turned frame skip off, you're going to see that we're going to start losing a couple frames, and sometimes Maria's jump, like right here, is going to lag out and be slower than it would be on real hardware. So even on the games that aren't as demanding on the Sega Saturn hardware in and of itself, I would still leave frame skip on for them, or else you're going to notice some odd aberrations. Now, another game that definitely pushes the Sega Saturn to its limit as far as 3D is concerned is going to be Burning Rangers. This is one I test on pretty much every new device, and I always test it on Mr. FPGA to see how the new core is performing. And you will see here that it gets through to the menu, and I am doing this in real time, and it's going to pull up the next option, Mode Select. We'll go with Story Mode. That's obviously what we want to do, is get into the actual game in and of itself. It's going to take a few seconds of thinking, and it'll give you the character selection screen. So far, everything seems to be working totally fine. It's drawing at 60 frames a second, and then once we actually get into the game here, you're going to get this notification about the navigation system, and unfortunately, the emulator is now going to crash back to the desktop. I could not get Burning Rangers to run no matter what I tried. I tried multiple copies. I've never had that issue on any other device I've tested it on. So what is this thing really good at? It is an extremely good 2D handheld. Game Boy Advance, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, tons of arcade games on MAME in 2D. It is going to absolutely chew through them, but as far as a 3D gaming device is concerned, it is definitely hit or miss. But let's move over to PlayStation 1 and try out Ridge Racer or R4 here. This is one of the more demanding games and one of the prettier games on the console in and of itself, in my opinion, and it is the one game that I always test because I played it so much. I 100% know the feel. And the good thing on the PlayStation 1 side of things is it is performing much better than Sega Saturn, and honestly, Saturn emulation is more difficult than PlayStation 1, so that is no surprise. You will see here that the frame rate is going to dip down here and there, but we're getting a better performance out of this than we are on the Sega Saturn side, so I feel like with some tweaks, you could enjoy this handheld for the majority of the PlayStation 1 library. It is not going to be perfect. You're going to see here we're down to like 24 to 22 frames per second, and it definitely slows the game down, but if we tweaked a few more things in the settings menu, I'm sure we could get it to a lock 30, but again, reviewing this out of the box, how consumers would find it. And as far as Nintendo 64 emulation is concerned, I gave it the hardest test I know of, and that is going to be Perfect Dark, and unfortunately this is something that I wouldn't classify, at least out of the stock settings on Linux, as a playable experience. It will run, it will boot, you'll get into the intro scene here, but you're going to start noticing it's going to lag out and freeze on certain frames. This was never the highest frame rate intro on Nintendo 64. It did not run anywhere near close to 60, but the staccato motion you're seeing here in the intro is not correct based upon any other Nintendo 64 emulation I have seen on more powerful devices. When I actually try to get past this next screen, it just freezes. That's as far as Perfect Dark would go for me. No matter where I hit a button on the menu, it froze on that cutscene. But anything 2D, NES, SNES, Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color, Sega Genesis, things like that, those systems that aren't 3D inherently are going to be great play on the Arc D. It is a little bit of a disappointment, I'm not going to lie, but again, Anbernic never said it ran the Sega Saturn perfectly. They just said it looked and felt and seemed like a Sega Saturn controller, and in that respect they got a 10 out of 10, 7 out of 10 on the functionality. If you want to emulate Sega Saturn on the go, just grab yourself a Steam Deck. No, I know it's not the same price, but it's what I'd recommend. If you want to see that Android test, leave me a comment down below, but we are done. Bye-bye.